Hi everybody. My name is Noam Ebner. I'm from the Warner Institute for Negotiation and Dispute Resolution at Creighton University School of Law. And today, the topic I'd like to discuss is the topic of trust in mediation. But not just trust in any mediation, trust in online mediation, and particularly trust in video-based online mediation. There are a lot of different moving parts in that subject matter, and indeed they line up the order of the day. So what are we going to be talking about? First of all, let's define trust and then understand what role does trust play in mediation and why it might be important for a mediator to be aware of trust dynamics and be aware of different methods for engendering trust and for being aware of trust dynamics that are going on in the room. Stepping aside from mediation for a while, we'll look at the online environment and how trust is made or challenged in the online environment, which poses much different challenges to trust than face-to-face encounters do. Finally, what we'll do is we'll tie all of this together and discuss the notion of how to build and create trust in video-based mediation. Specifically, we're going to take a look at the role of nonverbal communication, with the reason being that for so long online mediation was text-based and we lamented the loss of nonverbal cues, and all of a sudden we're back to mediating through video-based communication. Nonverbal communication is back, and we need to understand what that means for trust. So that's the order of the day. Let's get to work on that. What is trust? As you can see from the definition I've put up on the screen, trust involves dealing with uncertainty. In a situation where we can't force the other to do what we want, to act as we expect, the best that we can do is to reach a situation in which we expect them to act in a certain way. And trust is an acceptance of the risk involved in that expectation. So if it is an expectation that one's cooperation will be reciprocated in a situation where one stands to lose if the other chooses not to cooperate, what that basically means is that whenever we choose to trust someone, we're accepting risk. We're rolling the dice on that other person and hoping that they will live up to whatever it is we expect of them, whether they promised it to us or we understood that they were promising it to us. How does that work out in mediation between a mediator and a party? Well, we ask parties to trust us all of the time. And in essence, we ask them to assume risk all of the time. When we tell parties, you can tell us your story and this is a safe place, we're asking them to trust us. They're taking a risk. What if this isn't as safe a place as we've promised them? When we tell them in a private session or a caucus, anything that you tell us will stay right between with us and we're not going to pass it on to the other party. And then they tell us some secret information or their innermost feelings, they are doing so because they trust us to keep our promise. So, trust is obviously a very important tool for a mediator, and it's not something guaranteed. We often assume that parties come to mediation, so obviously they trust the mediator. Well, that's just not true. And we have to understand how trust works, and we have to be worthy of parties' trust, and we have to be able to earn parties' trust. So if that's what trust is, what does trust do in general in mediation and dispute resolution? So as you can see, specific research findings have identified trust as playing a key role in so many of the things that we're engaged in as conflict engagement professionals. And specific issues have been identified that are very important to mediation, such as cooperation. If we want parties to cooperate with us, if we want parties to work with us on solving problem, and so on, trust plays a central role. And beyond research findings, if you read any of the literature on dispute resolution, you find that the term trust is used time and again in conjunction with just about any of the good stuff that we rely on in order to get our jobs done. So obviously, trust is a key issue. But just saying trust is important isn't enough. We need to understand how to make it happen. So we need to conceptualize it, we need to understand how to work with it, and how to make it happen. And if we can do that, then we can achieve all the benefits. And I think that Roy Lewicki in the Field Book of Negotiation put this very simply into how trust can make the entire difference between whether we are able to work with parties or we find it very difficult to work with parties. So having built up trust as very, very important, let's find out how it happens. It doesn't just happen. Specific elements and specific action lead to trust forming or lead to trust degenerating. And we need to figure that out. So how does trust form? In the literature, we find several ways of conceptualizing ways that trust is engendered and comes to be. And one basic model says that trust has three sources or relies on three pillars. And the first of those is something called calculus-based or deterrence-based trust. And what that form of trust is that I trust the other person just as much as I can punish them if they don't keep trust with me. In other words, if I sign a contract with someone and that contract says that if either party breaks the contract, they will pay the other party a compensation of $1 million, then I will trust the other party to that contract $1 million. Okay, so that's calculus-based trust. It is not the warm and fuzzy association with trust that many of us have when we say or hear the word trust. It's a more rational, logical, economic based view of trust, and that's one way that trust is discussed in the literature. Another way that trust is discussed in the literature is that it is based on knowledge. The more we know about the other party, the more we understand where they're coming from, the more we understand how they act, the more we understand the decisions they've made in the past, and in general, the more familiarity we have with them and their actions and their history, the more we will trust them to do or not to do certain things. So trust comes from a more cognitive place that is not totally mathematical, but is still based upon what we know about the other party. And finally, a third source of trust is what is called identification-based trust. Identification-based trust means that the more I find another person similar to me, the more I identify with them or I find them identical to me, the more I will trust them. This means, and this is where trust gets really tricky, this means that the more I find a party similar to me in anything, the more I trust them. In other words, if I am trying to decide which of two car salesmen who are selling me the same Ford Focus, which of those two car salesmen to trust, I will, all things being equal, I will trust the car salesman who has blue eyes. Because I have blue eyes. I don't know if that comes out well, if that example works well with the webcam, but I will tend to trust the salesperson who is wearing a black shirt because that's the shirt that I am wearing. So due to this type of trust, we trust people who've studied at the same university we've studied at. We trust people who speak the same language that we do more than we trust people who speak another language. We trust people who seem to be part of the same team or group that we are more than we trust people who belong to an out group or a different type of team. And a lot of our trust decisions are based on this type of trust. So these are three ways or three sources of trust. Another way of looking at how trust forms is another breakdown into three. And the first thing is that we trust people who we view as being competent. So when we're asking ourselves the question, do we trust someone to follow through on their word? The first question we ask is, are they competent enough to follow through on their word? And think about the last craftsperson you've trusted, whether it was a mechanic to fix your car, or a plumber to fix your sink, or a lawyer to handle a legal dispute for you. A lot of our assessment of do we trust them comes from the basic question, well, first of all, are they competent? A second source of trust that is sometimes a follow-on consideration that we have is the question of benevolence. Do we assume and assess that this person has our best interests in mind and has good intentions towards us? Because if we think that they are benevolent towards us, then we will tend to trust them. And if we think that they are not benevolent towards us, then simply we will not trust us. Even if they are competent to do something, if we think that they are inclined to act against us, we won't trust them with the time of day. And finally, even after we've assessed someone for competence and we've assessed them for benevolence, the question of integrity comes to mind and comes to heart. The question is, do we view these people of simply of being straight shooters? Do we trust them to keep to their word and see that as something important? What do we think about their value system? And mainly, we will tend to trust people whom we view as being competent, benevolent, and being having good values and integrity. Now, back to mediation. That means that if we want to earn parties' trust, well, we should seem to be competent, benevolent, and to have good, solid integrity. Now, that should be kind of the ABC of mediation in the first place, but it's also the ABC of trust in mediation. But before we go there, let's talk about trust in mediation as having at least 3 separate relationships, trust relationships going on in the room. And those 3 relationships are the trust relationship between the mediator and one party, the trust relationship between the mediator and another party, and the trust relationship going on between the parties themselves. Now, in the context of this talk, I'm going to focus on the trust relationship between the mediator and a party or the parties. And I'm not going to relate to the trust relationship between the 2 parties themselves and how they view one another in terms of trust. What is the value of trust in mediation? So, very simply, trust is just about everything. In fact, when you ask parties and mediators what the number 1 attribute, what the most important quality you want to see in your mediator, or you think as a mediator is the most important in mediation, both parties and mediators rank the ability to engender parties' trust in the mediator as the number 1 leading quality that a mediator absolutely must have. And it's a make or break quality. However, here's where it gets tricky. And what gets tricky is the question of, wait, so how does a mediator engender parties' trust in the mediator? And the answer to that is it depends who you ask, because mediators have one answer to that question and parties have a very different answer to that question. This was research done by Stephen Goldberg in one study, and Goldberg and Shaw in another study, wonderful studies that showed that if you ask mediators what the most important thing is, they will generally focus on things like their credentials, their background, their studies, their degree, the trappings, the mahogany desk, their etc. And if you ask parties what engenders your trust in mediators, their answers have to do with something completely different. And it usually gravitates around terms related to rapport. Okay? It has to do with connection. It has to do with bonding. It has to do with the mediator being able to be in sync with the parties. So the ability to build rapport is essential for the mediator to engender trust in mediation. So, first of all, as mediators, it's important to set your expectations correctly vis-a-vis parties. So, the fact that you are a good mediator and a well-trained mediator, and that you've received a good education and a good mediation education, is not enough to make parties trust you. What will make parties trust you is your ability to connect with parties. And while many mediators understand that either on a cognitive level or an emotional level or both, and do this very, very naturally, online, this gets very, very tricky. So let's talk about the online environment and what it does to interpersonal interactions in general, and then we'll come back to mediation. And the first thing to say is that whatever your interaction online is, a sense of rapport is much trickier to achieve. And this holds true whether we're talking about video-based online interaction or text-based online interaction. Rapport is simply a challenge. Things that we can sense and do and transmit and receive when we're in a room with someone else are much more difficult to do when we are either looking into a video camera or when we are typing an email. It's just the way it is. So if we've said that rapport is key, then we are immediately challenged by challenges to rapport. And one huge challenge to rapport is simply that the media, whichever medium you are using online, whether it's text-based or video-based, there is a heightened sense of distance. So when we speak to each other, even if it's through video communication, we are still very aware of the fact that we aren't in the same room. There are all sorts of reasons for this, but basically the sense of distance leads to a certain sense of being reserved. It leads to a certain sense of well, they see me, but they don't see the whole picture. They only see what I choose to show them, and they don't see what I'm doing over here beside the screen or what I'm writing to myself here aside of the screen. So there's a sense of being protected by distance, and once we feel protected by distance, it sometimes leads us to act in ways that don't engender trust. Sometimes it leads us to overly contentious behavior. It leads us to be more competitive. All of these are challenges to trust online. Another basic way that the online environment challenges trust is that we have fewer cues. And when I say cues, it means that all of the minor details that we rely on in forming relationship with another are lessened by online communication. Of course, in text-based communication, we have no visual cues, or at least no non-verbal communication cues, body language, tone that we're so used to. Even in video-based communication, as we'll see later on in this talk, we still have fewer cues than we do when we're sitting in a room with someone. And since a lot of our trust decisions are based on these cues and how they play out in the room and how they help us form rapport, we're challenged when we communicate online. Not only are there fewer cues, but since this technology is relatively new to most of us, and it's new whether we're just coming online now or whether we've been talking to each other via Skype for 5 years by now, that still is relatively new. We've spent more time in our lives talking to people in a room than we have in video-based communication. So even if we have become quite used to communicating via different means afforded to us by communication technology, we still are less experienced in interpreting the different cues that we are afforded. And finally, and very powerfully, the online environment contains in itself different challenges to trust that have nothing to do with me and the other person sitting opposite across the internet with me. Quite simply, in general, many people are hesitant to trust the internet for anything. We see it as a scary place or a place that is not benevolent. We know that there are a lot of scammers out there, people out after our data, after our financial data, and we've been taught to be very, very careful, as if the internet is a bad neighborhood after dark. And that lack of trust in general in the internet and in online communication in particular, I think that it has a kind of a halo effect that carries on from my distrust of stuff going on the internet to trusting less in interpersonal interactions that happen over the internet. And the same thing has to do with our trust in the software or the platform that we're communicating through. If I'm not 100% sure that the system won't freeze up on me, or that the system is secure enough for the communication, or that the other party is competent at using the platform we're using. If I have reduced trust in all of those things, then I think that spills over into having a reduced amount of trust in the other as well, and in the mediator as well. So all of these challenges to trust are kind of rippling through the online environment, and in particular online interpersonal communication. And then what happens is that when we come back to video mediation, those things pose significant challenges to us. I've detailed this in greater detail in a paper called Trust in Online Dispute Resolution, Interpersonal Trust in Online Dispute Resolution. And there I've broken down different types of trust and different challenges to trust, and you can view it there. But for now, I think that we've laid out enough in order to bring things back to video mediation and to say we need to figure it out. So previously, online mediation for the past 10, 12 years has been primarily text-based. And while there were a few early efforts at trying to conduct video-based mediation through dedicated platforms, the truth is that the state of the art of video conferencing just wasn't there. And even those video conferencing platforms that could provide the goods were they were expensive, and they were you had to buy them, you had to spend a lot of money on them, and you had to if you wanted to use them in your professional services, then you had to license them and maybe brand them towards your own service. Not many people were using video communication in general for a long while after video communication became available, and all this led to a state of affairs that certainly up till about 2010, the lion's share of online mediation was absolutely text-based, and a lot of it was done through simply through email exchanges, and there's nothing wrong with that. Of course, that poses many challenges to trust in its own self. But now we're starting to see a shift since 2010, maybe 2011, as online video-based platforms are becoming more and more ubiquitous and much more accessible. And people are starting to use them for all sorts of purposes in their personal lives and their professional lives. Using them for mediation is becoming much more common. Ever since there has become a state of affairs in which there's competition in the market to provide people with free or very low-cost video platforms, and these platforms are constantly getting better and better and evolving to the point where you can conduct multi-party video conferences at once in high quality, high definition video and for free. So now the state of the art enables people, mediation practitioners, to say, you know what, I could actually take my practice online. And I think we're seeing that shift now from companies who could afford to purchase or program and set up their own video-based platform and offer online video-based mediation to a state of affairs in which just your everyday mediation practitioner, such as many of you watching this video might be, can just say, well, I can offer my services online in addition to my face-to-face practice. It can become a part of the services that I provide, and all I need to do that is to download or access online a very simple, a very common, and a free video conferencing platform. So I think we are in the process of seeing that shift. I've been tracking it, and we're definitely seeing it. And I think that while it's very dangerous to prophesize anything about technology, I think that within a couple of years, we're going to see this absolutely sweeping the mediation market, and we'll see many, many mediators offering their services online. What does this mean for online mediation is an open question, because there are many gaps in the literature as to what does everything we know about mediation, how does everything we know about mediation play out when you transfer it to the online video-based environment. Over the past 10 years, we've figured out how things are affected when you transfer them to the text-based environment. What happens when you transfer it to the video-based environment? There's not a lot of research on that. This is one of those areas where practice is a little ahead of research, but there is enough research to start giving pointers and indicators of what's going on. And what is indicated is that video reduces some problems, but it introduces others. And I'd like to start off by saying that many people said, yeah, well, all the problems that we associate with online communication and online communication being used for mediation will go away the moment we get some really good video. That's simply not true. There are new problems. So what are the problems that have to some extent gone away or have been reduced? One is that there's less sense of distance when dealing with video. We feel closer to each other now. I'm looking into your eyes. There's a big difference with that. There are more visual cues. You hear my tone of voice. You see my hands moving. You see my face. You see colors. You see background. Above all, the interaction is synchronous, whereas most of text-based mediation was asynchronous. Now we can be conversing in real time. So that are some of the issues that challenged online mediators based in text, and which posed huge challenges to trust building, and they have been not eliminated but reduced by video. What challenges have been introduced? Well, there are more and new kinds of technical mishaps that happen in video conferencing. And I'm sure you've all had those video conferencing situations where you're in the middle of a conversation with someone and 10 minutes in, you realize that your screen has frozen and the other hasn't heard anything. Many people are not yet skilled at troubleshooting video conferencing. If the call drops off, many people are unskilled at bringing it back. So that has posed a great challenge. And of course, once that happens, you become frustrated, and the other party becomes frustrated, and the mediator becomes frustrated, and that happens in real time. So everybody's sweating, trying to get the call back and trying to figure out what's going wrong. That frustration, even if you're successful in troubleshooting, that frustration is going to come back into the mediation, and it's going to affect trust. Another significant challenge is that sometimes video fools us into thinking that we can act or we should act or that everything is the same as in the room face-to-face encounter, when the truth is that there are many different things, and we need to be mindful of those when we're dealing with trust. Now, the most important or the major set of differences between text-based communication and video-based communication, and particularly as it relates to trust, is, as I've said, the return of nonverbal communication. So once again, we see each other. And once again, we cough in the middle of our conversations. Once again, these little things that people do have found their way back into interpersonal communication. Now, that does not mean that nonverbal cues through video are transmitted or are interpreted the same way that they are in face-to-face, at the same table, in the same room communication. However, we become less attuned to them, and we kind of assume that things will play out and be the same. And for that reason, I'd like to spend some real time and dedicate some special attention to this topic of nonverbal communication and video-based mediation, because this is an area in which you can make or break an online video-based mediation. And in order to delve into this topic and discuss it fully, I've invited in someone who I regard as being the expert on this topic, Jeff Thompson. Jeff Thompson is perhaps the only person out there doing empirical research on video-based mediation and the topic of nonverbal communication, and I've asked him into this course to share his thoughts with us. So let's go over to that. Hi everybody, and I'd like to welcome Jeff Thompson. Jeff is so many things, and I'll introduce just a few of them. Jeff is, first of all, Jeff is a mediator. Jeff is, he's an expert on online communication and on social media. Jeff Thompson is conducting research, doctoral level research, on mediation and nonverbal communication in mediation. And he is also a detective with the NYPD and conducting research on crisis and hostage negotiations. And if that's not enough to fill his plate, I don't know what is. Hi, Jeff. Thanks so much for joining us.
Noam, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Great. And what I like to speak with you about today is connected actually to your main line of research, or at least your PhD research on mediation and nonverbal communication, with the point being that as online mediation moves into the age of video interactions such as the one we're having right now, it actually does bring nonverbal communication back into the mix of what makes a mediation and what mediators' skill set needs to be. When mediation was still buried in text, as it has been for the past decade or so, we could kvetch about not being able to have all the nonverbal cues, but they also didn't get in the way and we didn't have to manage them. And now here we go, video is back, nonverbal communication is back. What do we do? How does that affect mediation?
Well, firstly, thanks for having me participate in this. I think looking at it from the mindset of the research that I'm doing for my PhD on nonverbal communication and mediation, well, basically the basic premise of it is I was trying to figure out what makes a mediator effective. In doing my literature review, I lumped everything into three macro or top level skills required of a mediator to be effective at what they do. And first of all, effective at what they do, what are they trying to do? They're trying to help two people negotiate.
Right.
And the mediator is sort of that guide in the process. As you'll hear me say that a lot, they're a guide. So if they're guiding people, they have to be very effective. And the three main skills are building rapport, developing trust, and displaying professionalism.
Right.
All those are very, very interconnected because, as a quick sidebar, you look at that, in some of the literature you read about how do you build rapport, it's by developing trust. How do you develop trust? By building rapport. It's always at top level. Yeah. What did I do for my research? I went a little bit deeper, the next level, trying to figure out what exactly is it, how you developing and building trust.
The nuts and bolts of what do you actually do. Yeah.
So my main argument, and I don't think it's that far out there, is it's primarily relying on nonverbal cues, micro cues and elements. Mm-hmm. So the little things create the big thing of trust, for example, like we're saying. So you look at it, it's all these little things that on their own, which I know we'll talk about much more later, like hand gestures, eye contact, head nodding. So if you look back on it, for everyone that's listening, when they first go through their mediation course, it's easy to talk about, neutrality, your opening statement. It's easy to say, hey, you did that good or bad. But again, my argument is it's all these little or easy to overlook micro nonverbal cues and elements.
Right.
And what do I mean by cues? That's anything that the body's doing. What do I mean by elements? That's the non-movement factors such as, well, for one, we're talking about today, technology, the environment, like the room behind you and those other things. So it's very, very critical. And I think so important, the nonverbal communication. And one thing I'll say too is keep in mind too, like some people say that's for like an expert level or to look at it after you get the basic nuts and bolts. As you said, nonverbal communication is the nuts and bolts.
Yeah. And you can, and it's basic level enough so that you can, if you can mess up a mediation process through it, then it is certainly part of the basic level of what you need to know.
Right.
So could you give us some examples? It doesn't necessarily have to be from the online environment, which we'll get into, but just a basic sense of a point of time or a mediator tool that really does depend on nonverbal and where that and what that looks like.
Okay, so one thing, part of my research, what I did is I engaged mediators from all over the world, asking similar questions. One thing I was looking at, especially through the field of studying psychology, they talk about first impressions, how important first impressions are. Then you connect that with mediation and how in mediation everyone likes to promote the art of mediation, not necessarily the science sometimes. So connecting the psychology of first impressions with the art of mediation, I looked at the mediator's introduction.
Okay.
So overwhelmingly, basically almost, and you rarely have this, 100% of mediators said the introduction is very important. Why is the mediator's introduction important? Well, again, look, step back for a second, how I said, and I think you agreed, the mediator is a guide in the process. Sure. What are they guiding? During that introduction, they have to explain what mediation is, because we all know from our experience, quite often people aren't really sure what mediation is, or they have maybe a misperception. Then also, in that very beginning first impression, like psychology shows, that has an impact on the rest of any interaction that you're having, especially in a mediation session. So you look at that, the introduction, you have to explain the process, but you also have to build and develop rapport, which also creates trust. So you look at that, tie it all into nonverbal communication. One thing, your tone. You're not just explaining what mediation is, but are you doing it in a way that's friendly? You can also be assertive in your tone, but also friendly. Saying, hey, look, this is what neutrality means. This is what I'm doing as the mediator. This is what I'm not going to do as the mediator. Compared to saying, well, no, I'm your mediator, and this is what neutrality is. Or look at it the other end of the spectrum. Hey, Noam, this is what mediation is. It's like one of those midnight salesmen that where you can't sleep, you watch it on TV, and you bought all those
air mattresses. You
don't want mediation to be considered one of those midnight infomercials.
Right. Wow. So I think the one very important thing that you're saying, and it's often obvious to people practicing it, but not so much to people just starting to get into it, is that nonverbal communication is not identical with body language. Very often people identify it with body language, and I hear that and the first thing you tossed into the pot is tone. What else do you toss into that pot? So if we have tone and we have body, what else do we have?
This is why we've had many conversations, and for the people watching this is a great segue to an acronym that I created for my research.
I was hoping you'd pick up on that.
I have a note here to say as well. Thanks. It's there's an acronym that I created as part of my research, and I know we use it in some of the research that we were doing in one of our research papers. It's called META. And basically, you're right, you hit the nail on the head there, is body language, quite often people equate with nonverbal communication. Body language is an element of nonverbal communication. The way it is, I break it down into 5, META. So there's movement, environment, touch, tone, and appearance. And tone is one we already talked about. Maybe if you'd like, you want me to go into them just a little bit?
Sure. Well, so let's talk about at least a couple of them. Let's talk about movement and environment. I think those are two really biggies. Okay.
And maybe in the context of also using online technology too.
Right.
You talk about movement, and I know it's something we've discussed before too, is movement is your body language, facial expressions, your body posture, your orientation. You look at it within the scope of also using technology. We have video, we can see each other. But now imagine if I'm just sitting here like this, you won't be able to see any of my open-handed gestures, which research time and again shows and talks about building rapport, developing trust. Where if I'm back here while you saw me talking, if I bring my hand up at least, you're working within the elements that you have.
Right.
And then you, with your posture, say if I'm just leaning back like this, right? What's Noam going to think if you're a party to mediation? Now, think about its clusters are very important. One cue on their own, quite often people say, okay, well, if I don't use any hand gestures, I can still build trust. Yes, I agree. You add up again all these little things, it's the big picture. So leaning back, okay, not a big deal, it looks like I have a pinhead. But now what about with this, if I'm like this the entire conversation? Well, I'm not even making eye contact. coming back to you now, purposely zooming myself in, how important is eye contact with building a rapport, developing trust? It's incredibly important. It's almost number one in almost any research study.
Right.
Think about how important, look, we're halfway across the world, but we have this visual element of technology. We can still utilize eye contact. So that's really important. And then the other is the environment. Think about, in the context again, if you're using technology for your mediation session, the environment, where are you having this discussion? Are you having it in a cafe or like a Starbucks where there's a zillion people going on and there's many, many distractions? And then just, I know you only wanted me to do those two, but I'm going to throw in the other three.
Oh, keep going. This is gold.
Touch. Quite often I talk about touch is like, if you shake the hands with the person. Another incredibly important element to touch is, it's called adapters. And it's things that show anxiety, stress, discomfort. It means like, always touching, fidgeting.
Yeah.
Or here's a great one when I was teaching hostage negotiators. Quite often that's not face-to-face, it's over just the phone.
Yeah.
But can you hear that? It's...
Oh, the click, yeah, I caught the click, yeah.
Imagine it, look, we have this box here, you can't see everything else, but right below the screen, as I'm explaining to you what the mediation process is, all you hear is that, and you're like, what the hell is that noise?
Right.
So it's leaking out, and as the mediator, you're a guide. You're either guiding to be conducive towards a negotiation or messing things up. And if one thing, you're leaking out that stress, you're not going to help the party. Your tone again. Go ahead.
I'm just saying that what I'm hearing from you is that we need to be very conscious that we appear in the screen. And I know that when I go like this, so it will appear as a screen on the screen. So we have this rectangle or square that we appear on. And anything we want to be inside the conversation overtly needs to happen inside this square. So if I want my hand gestures to be in, I need them to be in. Everything I learned about body language, about keeping an open posture and being open, nobody sees that right now unless I somehow manage to bring it in and say, look, right? And now you can see some of that. This can create distance on screen just as it creates distance in person, and this leaning in can also create a closeness. I don't know if it's a good closeness or an effective closeness. You could speak more about that than I can, but it does change. On the other hand, you're saying we need to be mindful of what's happening outside of the screen. And if we spend too much time, if we're reading something on the side, if we're clicking our pen on the side, if we're fidgeting with something on the side, then that's not going to be part of the conversation overtly, but it is going to affect what's going on inside the conversation anyway.
Right.
Wow.
100%. And just to add a couple things to that is also, you think about during your introduction or what have you, how you're going to take notes. So I have my notebook right here while we're talking. Right, so in a face-to-face mediation, while someone's talking, you explain already, while you're saying certain things, I might take a couple notes. While you were just talking, I wrote down a couple things. Think about that. Are you incorporating it because it's outside our box?
Right.
When you just said something, I wrote down 3 C's. But now imagine if I didn't explain in my introduction that, hey, look, you can't see it, but occasionally I might look down to write some notes, and I'll explain that to you. So what do I mean by the 3 C's? Again, we already said this: clusters, context of the situation. It's a mediation when I explain that I'm taking notes, but then also congruence. And this is something incredibly important because even what's going on outside here, nonverbal communication's importance is not just for the person that I'm trying to build trust with on the other side of the screen. It's also for me.
Yeah.
And talking about congruence, say with the hand gestures. Open-handed gestures help create rapport. That's what the research says. Now, here are my hands. What happens? I put my hands down here. I'm using open-handed gestures. You can't see it, but what's it doing to my tone? Think about this, everyone. You don't have to do it right now while you're listening, but think about next time. This is an exercise I love to do. Try and talk to somebody using open-handed gestures. Then the next time, talk to them just pointing the entire time. Now look, if I did it with here. No, and I'm pointing at you right now, and now I'm using open-handed gestures. If you look at this, my voice changes.
Yeah.
There's a great video by Amy Cuddy. If you Google it, Amy Cuddy TED Talk, that explains it much better than I did in these few seconds. But that shows you the importance of the interconnectedness of your body and your tone. So all of those nonverbal elements, it's not just for the other person, it's for you as well.
Right. Right. Wow. Let me just ask you in closing, given that this is a very, very introductory session on the topic, and I think that people are going to need time to practice and to improve their online video skill set in order to even start figuring this out for themselves, myself included. Are there any do's and don'ts? One or two of each do's and don'ts, putting yourself in the mediator's chair, conducting online video-based mediation, that you'd tell a mediator, just don't do that. I mean, understandably, knocking the camera off the computer would be a don't. But is there anything else that you'd say, well, this is a nearly never do, and this is a nearly always do, with regards to...
So a few things that I would recommend, in keeping in mind that we've added the element of technology for your mediation session. As like any mediator, you need to prepare, but now you also need to be prepared with the technology. And one thing that we've discussed many times before is, what's the backup plan? Yeah. Technology crashes. As great as it is, as great as we're halfway across the world, what do you do if it doesn't work? Because you think about how great it is, what happens when it starts not working? And again, not only are you the guide in the process, but now also is the technology. So is the technology creating frustrations if it's choppy? What do you do?
Right.
As the mediator, have a backup plan, then have a backup plan to the backup plan.
Right. And
also, yeah.
No, I'm just saying, and research has also shown that a mediator's expertise with the platform, including their ability to troubleshoot, and including that connects directly to the topic of parties' trust in the mediator, which is them just bringing us, kind of trying to wrap this all together. So what else, if we'd combine trust and nonverbal communication, what would be another do or don't that you'd say?
Well, I think it's finding the ideal distance, as we see, where when you're talking to the person. Again, you have that added element of visuals. So you want to try and directly nonverbal aspects are your hand gestures, whether they can see it or not. Occasionally, you want them to be able to see it, the eye contact. Think about it in a mediation session. If you say, oh, wow, that is really important. When you want to stress a point, it's your hand, you can move in.
Right.
Sometimes if the two parties are talking, you can really move back.
Right. You can
Another
give
thing,
space.
too, is it's visual. And just like the last say of the meta acronym is appearance. Like, I'm sitting in my apartment right now, but I'm dressing for the part. So you're not going to wear maybe your favorite t-shirt if you're doing your mediation from home. Because think about that, the impression. No one, quite often, again, with these little things, they might not point out, hey, Noam never had eye contact during this video mediation. Noam never used any hand gestures. He never moved his body posture, and he was wearing his Transformers t-shirt. So you think, people just say, you know what, I felt like Noam didn't seem all that professional. Yeah. Or it didn't seem like he listened to me. So people won't be able to pinpoint it. But it's all these little things. As the mediator, you need to be the expert guide. And it's always a work in progress. It's just to be mindful each time you do it. Hey, check in with yourself in the beginning to prepare, then as you're going. And again, if you get frustrated by the technology or whatever is going on, you're going to guide the people down that way. So remember, checking in with yourself and all these little things add up to the big things.
Jeff, I want to thank you. This is such a treasure trove of not just information, but of real guidance. And the thing that I'm going to do as soon as we stop is something that is really a benefit of video conferencing technology, and I'm sure that I'm going to offer it to everybody watching and listening to this to do right after their sessions, is to go back to the archive of your conversation, of your mediation, of whatever engagement you had online, and just look at yourself and see what you're doing. And I know that tone is an important part of it, but I think that I'm going to watch a few seconds of this session after turning the volume down and seeing, looking at myself, seeing what happened and how I acted in something, and then looking at you, because I'm sure you did it all better, whatever better does. Well, that's my impression of you, and seeing what I can learn from that. And I think that offering that as the best practice tool to students to just go out and do that, it's really great when the medium is the message and the playground at once.
Yeah, and it's always a work in progress. So for when the people do that, don't be hard on yourself. It's always, what can you learn? What did you do good? And what maybe do you want to adjust and change? And then just the idea is to be better in the next session. Jeff,
thanks so much for all this.
Thank you. And again, I appreciate it. And hopefully the viewers, you can pick something out of this. And again, it's just thank you for this opportunity.
Take care, Jeff. Before moving on to suggesting that you actually do some of those exercises that Jeff and I discussed, I'd like to summarize some of what we spoke about in this talk and offer you some things to keep in mind as you're contemplating this topic of trust in video-based mediation. And the first one is that trust is your most powerful currency. And while most mediation education deals with it in a relatively shallow is perhaps the wrong word, but very lightly. Trust is a huge field of study. And the more you can learn about it, the more likely you are to realize just what it is you need to do in order to be able to engender parties' trust in you. So instead of just assuming that the fact that you've discussed it, that you've dealt with it in a few simulations, you've dealt with it in practice several times, then you've figured it out. There are books and articles and lectures and, well, not courses yet, but there's a lot of material out there on trust. There's a world of material out there on trust, and I strongly recommend that you go out there and treat yourself, because it's fascinating literature and fascinating material out there. Go treat yourself to that. You'll be doing yourself a great favor. A second thing is to remember that once you are mediating online as opposed to mediating in the room, you are playing on an uphill playing field in terms of trust. And that just means that you need to be ever more mindful of trust dynamics and of things that are going on in the room and of things that you do intentionally in order to build trust. You can never do too much of that in online mediation. Remember that video is an illusion, okay? It makes us feel to some extent that distance is reduced, that we're almost in the same room with each other, and that everything we're used to in face-to-face communication is back and is with us again, and we can trust our senses and we can trust the other senses to transmit and interpret cues and information and make trust decisions and actions in the same way that we do while we're in the room. It just doesn't work that way. It's an illusion. Okay, so be very mindful of online trust. As I've suggested, learn a little bit more about it, and never assume that just because we've moved to video, we've solved all the trust problems. And finally, unintentional trust slip-ups can be very, very expensive in terms of a mediator's ability to conduct a process. If you slip up, or if parties perceive you to slip up, there's going to be a big price to pay, particularly if you slip up in trust. So trust is something to keep in mind, to be very intentional about, not just to assume that if I do my job right, trust will form. No, we have to be proactive. We have to look for opportunities to appear benevolent, opportunities to appear competent, opportunities to show our integrity, because these are things that are going to build and reinforce trust. So the more intentional we are about trust, the better we'll do. Okay? And we can fall back on that later if we do slip up. But first we need to build it. We need to build it up. Now, how can we get good at doing this in online mediation? I usually suggest starting off with a few simple exercises that can be done in about 10 minutes each, and they can be done either one right after the other, or do one once and then a few days later do the next. And here's the first. The first is to sit in front of your computer and turn on your webcam, and to video record yourself doing some part of a mediation. The easiest part to do on your own is the mediator's introduction. Use a contextual mediator's introduction that you will use when you're introducing a video-based mediation, as I'm sure you've prepared already. How do you introduce the platform you're using? How do you introduce the way that communication will happen, and so on? And give this introduction, and then click pause, and then view yourself giving this introduction. And in this setting trust aside, okay, just look at your own body language and at other nonverbal communication elements, okay? So notice how you're sitting, notice how your voice sounds, look at your body language and what that and what that seems to signify or transmit, okay? So this is the first step in becoming attuned to your own nonverbal communication patterns, okay? We're not trying to draw any deep conclusions here. We're just trying to get in touch with ourselves. And then conduct the second exercise. And the second exercise is to do another recording, either of the same mediator's introduction or some other part of mediation that you can make up or do in a simulation. And once again, do it in front of a webcam because you're doing a video-based mediation. And this time, as you view that recording of yourself giving that introduction or giving that talk or talking with parties or something, ask yourself, what can I see? What can I elicit from these 3, 4, 5 minutes of video recording if I look at everything happening through a frame of trust? And it's amazing how many items you'll be able to put your finger on and saying, that's a trust issue. That motion, that movement, that word that I used, that sentence that I said, that tone of voice, that might affect trust in this way, that might affect trust in that way. And it's amazing how once you put on trust glasses, you'll realize how your actions interact with the notion of trust. And then you'll start to become attuned with how you, in particular, act in frames of trust. And then the third exercise is to, once again, with trust in mind, construct a video-based mediation environment. In other words, think on the following things. Think of where you're sitting, of what room or office you're in, what the background is, what you're wearing, what your seat looks like, and everything that has to do with how parties will see me and what they will notice as I am on screen. Okay? And then you do your best to construct something you see as a good professional setting, and then you do exactly the same exercise. You record a video in which you introduce mediation, or you give another talk of some sort to video-based parties. And once again, you view this video from a trust perspective, and you're always asking yourself, what does any of this has to do with trust? But this time, ignore yourself, ignore body language, ignore your tone, okay? Instead, try and be kind of more general, zoom out and try and view it as the whole. What does the setting, what do the colors you have in the background, what do the books you have in the background, or the clothes you're wearing, etc., how do they all affect trust? And again, I'm not going to tell you what to look out for because it'll be very simple. The moment you put on these trust glasses, you're going to start seeing everything in terms of trust. Once you've done these 3 exercises, you will have gained for yourself a new perspective and skill set of engendering trust in video-based online mediation that you'll be able to use in all the interactions that you conduct. I hope that this talk has piqued your interest in the topic, and that you start to see these things play out for yourselves in your very next video-based mediation. Anybody wanting to learn more? There's a lot of material out there. I have several papers up on my SSRN page. If you Google Noam Ebner SSRN, you'll see some papers up there, and perhaps most importantly, some of those papers will provide you with a much wider bibliography for things that you can look for as you go about learning this topic. Thank you, everybody.